We like to think of history as a straight line, a steady climb from stone tools to smartphones. But the deeper we dig, the more we realize history is actually a graveyard of geniuses. Imagine cities carved into solid rock, empires that mastered iron while others used sticks, and cultures that vanished so completely we forgot they ever existed. Today we're uncovering 12 civilizations that defy everything we thought we knew. These aren't just myths. They are anomalies that shouldn't have existed. Let's start in a place where, by all laws of nature, no great empire should ever have stood. The middle of the Arabian Desert. If you were a traveler 2,000 years ago, lost among the sun-scorched canyons of present-day Jordan, you'd expect to find nothing but sand, heat, and death. But then, you'd turn a corner through a narrow, towering crack in the rock called the Siq, and suddenly, your heart would stop. Emerging from the dust is Petra, a city of rose-red stone, not built on the ground but carved directly into the mountains. Giant facades 50 feet tall, with Hellenistic columns and intricate carvings all born from the canyon walls. This was the capital of the Nabataeans. And for a long time historians asked, how? How did a group of former nomads build a metropolis in a place with no permanent rivers, no reliable rainfall, and temperatures that could bake the earth dry? The answer is that the Nabataeans were the greatest hydraulic wizards of the ancient world. While other civilizations prayed to gods for rain, the Nabataeans hacked the desert's own geography to their advantage. They understood something others didn't. When it does rain in the desert, it doesn't just drizzle, it floods. These flash floods were usually deadly, but the Nabataeans saw them as a gold mine. They engineered a hidden network of thousands of underground cisterns, dams, and ceramic pipes. They coated their reservoirs with a special waterproof plaster that remained functional for centuries. They literally caught the desert. It's estimated they could store enough water to support 30,000 people year-round in a place that receives less than 6 inches of rain a year. This wasn't just survival. It was a flex. While their enemies arrived at the gates of Petra exhausted and dehydrated, the Nabataeans were inside, enjoying lush gardens and even, believe it or not, a massive swimming pool. But water wasn't their only trick. They were the ultimate middlemen of the Silk Road. They controlled the trade of frankincense and myrrh, substances that were more valuable than gold in the Roman Empire. They grew so wealthy that they didn't even need a standing army to protect their secrets. The desert did it for them. If an invading army tried to follow them, the Nabataeans would simply vanish into the canyons, closing off their hidden water taps and watching as their pursuers succumbed to thirst. Eventually, the Roman Empire did what it does best. It absorbed them. But the Nabataeans didn't go out with a bang, they just integrated. And then, as trade routes shifted to the sea, Petra was slowly abandoned to the sand. For over 1,000 years, it became a lost city, known only to local Bedouins. It shouldn't have existed because the desert should have won. But for a few centuries, the Nabataeans proved that if you can master the water, you can master the world. Now, if you think you know Chinese history, Sanxingdui is going to break your brain. For decades, the story of China was simple. Civilization started in the Yellow River Valley and spread outward. But in 1986, in the Sichuan province, a group of workers accidentally stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. They opened a pit, and what stared back at them looked like it came from another planet. These are the Sanxingdui artifacts. And the word weird doesn't even begin to cover it. We're talking about massive, towering bronze statues and hundreds of masks with eyes that literally protrude out of their heads like binoculars. These figures have enormous ears, hawk-like noses, and eerie, rectangular smiles. They look nothing like the people of ancient China, and they look nothing like the art being made by their neighbors at the time. The most breathtaking discovery? A bronze spirit tree that stands nearly 13 feet tall. It's decorated with flowers, fruit, and 9 birds perched on its branches. It's delicate, complex, and incredibly difficult to cast even by today's standards. This suggests that 3,000 years ago there was a secret superpower in the heart of China that possessed metallurgical skills far beyond what we thought possible for that era. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. There are no written records. Not a single word. We have this massive, wealthy, and technologically advanced society that existed for hundreds of years, and then they just vanished. They didn't just leave. It looks like they held a massive funeral for their own culture. They smashed their most precious bronze treasures, burned them, buried them in pits, and then walked away into the shadows of history. Why the bulging eyes? Some archaeologists suggest they represent ancestor worship, the idea of a leader who could see into the spirit world. Others wonder if it's a depiction of a specific physical deformity or even just a radical artistic movement we don't understand. But the real insight here is how Sanxingdui forces us to rewrite history. It proves that China wasn't born from one single cradle. It was a collection of distinct, brilliant, and sometimes alien-looking cultures that were eventually swallowed by the tide of the Han identity. Sanxingdui is a reminder that an entire world, a world of giant bronze trees and birdmen, can exist for a millennium, achieve greatness, and then be completely forgotten until a shovel hits the dirt in a random field in 1986. It makes you wonder, what else is still under our feet, waiting to stare back at us with those giant bronze eyes? While the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt get all the glory, there was a culture in Eastern Europe, modern-day Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova, that was doing something far more radical 6,000 years ago. These were the Cucuteni Trypillia people, and to understand them, you have to understand a cycle that seems completely insane to our modern minds. Imagine a city, not just a small village, but a massive, planned urban center with thousands of houses arranged in concentric circles, stretching as far as the eye can see. At their peak, these were the largest settlements on Earth. They were masters of pottery, creating intricate, swirling designs that look like something out of a modern art gallery. They were peaceful, they were organized, and they were stable. But then, every 60 to 80 years, something terrifying happened. The entire population would gather their belongings, walk out of their homes, and systematically set the entire city on fire. Think about that for a second. Everything they had built, the grain stores, the temples, the homes of their ancestors, was reduced to ash in a single massive inferno. And here's the kicker. They didn't do this because they were under attack. They didn't do it because of a plague. We know this because they didn't just run away. They moved a few miles down the road and built the exact same city all over again, only to burn it down again a few decades later. Archaeologists have spent years trying to solve the burned house mystery. Some thought it was accidental, but you don't accidentally burn down 2,000 houses at once, over and over again for 3 millennia. This was a ritual. This was a choice. Was it a way to cleanse the land? Was it a religious sacrifice on a massive scale? Or perhaps they understood something about sustainability that we've forgotten. By burning the settlement, they sterilized the ground, got rid of pests, and returned the nutrients to the soil. They refused to let their society become stagnant or decayed. They chose to be reborn in fire. Today, all that remains of these megasites are layers of burnt clay, thousands of tons of it, buried beneath the wheat fields of Ukraine. It challenges our entire definition of progress. We build things to last forever. The Cucuteni Trypillia built things to be beautiful, to be lived in, and then to be released. In a world obsessed with accumulation, they were a civilization that found power in letting go. They were the architects of the temporary, the masters of the flame, and perhaps the most organized rebels in human history. For thousands of years, the world's history books had a massive gaping hole. We knew about the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon, but there was a third player, a superpower that once dominated the rugged highlands of modern-day Turkey that had been completely erased from memory. They were the Hittites, and for a long time, we thought they were nothing more than a footnote in ancient texts. But when archaeologists finally uncovered their capital, Hattusa, they realized they hadn't just found a lost tribe. They had found the Bronze Age's version of the military-industrial complex. The Hittites were the masters of a technology that changed the face of warfare forever. Iron. While the rest of the world was still clashing with soft bronze swords that would bend or blunt in the heat of battle, the Hittites were experimenting with the Earth's most stubborn metal. They figured out how to smelt iron at temperatures others couldn't reach. It was the ultimate, top-secret weapon. Imagine a world of wooden shields and copper knives suddenly meeting a wall of iron-tipped spears and reinforced chariots. It wasn't just a fight, it was a technological slaughter. But they weren't just brutes. The Hittites were surprisingly sophisticated. They were the first civilization to create a constitutional-style monarchy where the king's power was checked by a council of nobles. And in 1259 BCE, after the massive Battle of Kadesh against Ramses II of Egypt, the largest chariot battle in history, the Hittites signed the world's first recorded peace treaty. We actually have a copy of it today, carved in clay and even a replica in silver, hanging in the United Nations headquarters. It's a testament to a people who knew how to start a war, but also how to end one. So, how does a superpower with iron weapons and international treaties just vanish? Around 1200 BCE, the entire Mediterranean world went into a collective seizure known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Trade routes snapped, cities were burned, and the Hittite Empire shattered. Within a single generation, their great capital was abandoned, and their language, a unique Indo-European tongue, fell silent. The Hittites shouldn't have been forgotten. They were the bridge between the East and the West, the pioneers of the Iron Age, and the first diplomats of the ancient world. They proved that no matter how advanced your weapons are, or how many treaties you sign, a civilization is only as strong as the world around it. When the system fails, even the giants of iron can turn back into dust. If you travel to the north-central coast of Peru about 5,000 years ago, you'd find something that, historically speaking, shouldn't exist. This is Norte Chico, the oldest known civilization in the Americas and arguably the most peaceful society in human history. Now, why is this an anomaly? Because everywhere else in the world, the birth of a civilization usually follows a bloody pattern. You find weapons, you find massive defensive walls, and you find art depicting kings crushing their enemies. War, as it turns out, is a powerful motivator for building a state. But in the 30 major cities of Norte Chico, archaeologists have found nothing. No weapons, no battlements, no mutilated remains. For over 1,000 years, they built a complex society without, apparently, ever needing to kill each other. And that's not even the weirdest part. This was a civilization of great architects who built massive stone pyramids and sprawling circular plazas, but they did it without the basics. They had no pottery, they had no visual art. They didn't even have a grain-based diet, which we used to think was the must-have fuel for any civilization. Instead of wheat or corn, they lived on fish and cotton. Yes, cotton. This was a cotton economy. The people in the inland cities grew massive amounts of cotton to make fishing nets, which they then traded with the coastal villages for sardines and anchovies. It was a perfect symbiotic loop of trade. They didn't need to conquer, they just needed to cooperate. But don't mistake their lack of art for a lack of intelligence. To build their pyramids, they used an ingenious invention called shikras, woven reed bags filled with large stones. These bags acted as seismic shock absorbers. In a region prone to massive earthquakes, the Norte Chico architects were building quake-proof skyscrapers while the rest of the world was still living in huts. They also had a deep connection to music and mathematics. Excavations have uncovered 32 flutes made of condor and pelican bones, and evidence of quipu, the complex system of knotted strings used for record-keeping that the Incas would perfect thousands of years later. Norte Chico eventually faded away, likely due to climate shifts that made their irrigation systems fail. But their legacy is a challenge to our modern world. They prove that human greatness doesn't have to be written in blood. They built pyramids not to glorify a warrior king, but to bring people together in a shared space of trade and music. They were the architects of peace, and in the long history of our violent species, that might be the greatest mystery of all. In the 3rd century AD, a Persian prophet named Mani wrote that there were 4 great kingdoms in the world: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. Now be honest, how many of you have heard of Aksum? For most people, the history of African superpowers begins and ends with Egypt. But tucked away in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, there was a civilization so wealthy and so influential that it dictated the flow of trade between the Roman Empire and India for centuries. The Aksumite Empire shouldn't have been forgotten, but somehow it slipped through the cracks of Western history. At its peak, Aksum was the ultimate gatekeeper. They controlled the Red Sea trade routes, meaning if a Roman emperor wanted silk from China or spices from India, his gold had to pass through Aksumite hands first. They were cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and most importantly, they were the first African empire to mint their own coins in gold, silver, and bronze. On these coins, written in Greek and Gaze, they sent a message to the world: we are equals to Rome. But Aksum wasn't just about money. It was about massive, mind-bending engineering. If you visit the city of Aksum today, you'll see the stelae, monolithic granite obelisks that reach up to 100 feet into the sky. Here's the kicker. These aren't made of stacked bricks. Each one is a single solid piece of stone, carved to look like a multi-story building with windows and doors. We're talking about moving blocks of granite weighing 160 tons across miles of rugged terrain without modern machinery. How they stood them up perfectly straight remains a subject of intense debate among engineers today. Aksum was also a pioneer in faith. Long before much of Europe converted, the Aksumite king Ezana adopted Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the first Christian states in the world. According to local tradition, and this is where history meets legend, Aksum is also the final resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, brought there by the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So why did this superpower vanish? It wasn't a single war. Instead, it was a slow strangulation. As the Islamic caliphates rose in the 7th century, they took control of the Red Sea trade. Aksum was cut off from the world's economy. The empire didn't disappear overnight. It retreated into the mountains, evolving into the medieval kingdom of Ethiopia. The Aksumites proved that history isn't just written in the north. It was written in the gold coins of the African highlands and the towering granite needles that still point to the stars. They were the bridge between worlds, a forgotten giant that reminds us that power isn't about where you are on the map. It's about who holds the keys to the world's wealth. For more than half a century, if you opened any history textbook in America, the story began exactly the same way. It was called the Clovis First Theory. The narrative was simple. About 13,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending, a group of brave hunters crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. They moved through an ice-free corridor and spread across the continent with a revolutionary piece of technology: the Clovis point. These fluted stone spearheads were the high-tech gear of the ancient world. They were beautiful, lethal, and so effective at bringing down mammoths and giant bison that the Clovis people became the dominant culture almost overnight. For decades, archaeologists treated the Clovis date of 13,000 years ago like a sacred wall. Nothing existed before it. Anyone who claimed to find older artifacts was often laughed out of the room. Clovis was the beginning. Period. But then, the wall started to crumble. It started with a site called Monte Verde in Chile, thousands of miles south of the ice bridge. Archaeologists found evidence of human settlement there that was at least 1,000 years older than Clovis. If Clovis were the first, how did they get to the tip of South America before they even finished unpacking in the north? The math didn't add up. Then came the ghost tracks in White Sands, New Mexico. In 2021, researchers confirmed human footprints pressed into the mud of an ancient lake bed. These weren't just a few years older. They were dated to 21,000 years ago. That's nearly 8,000 years before the Clovis people supposedly arrived. These footprints tell a story of children splashing in puddles and teenagers hunting giant sloths in a world that, according to our old textbooks, was supposed to be empty of humans. So, who were the Clovis people if they weren't the first? Insights from modern DNA and archaeology suggest that Clovis wasn't a single race of people, but rather a technology. A successful brand of spearhead that spread like wildfire across existing populations. Think of it like the first viral trend of the Americas. The Clovis culture shouldn't have been the start of our story, but for a long time, our own biases made us blind to what was right under our feet. Today, the mystery of the first Americans is wider than ever. We now know that people were sailing down the Pacific coast or trekking through the ice long before the Clovis point ever drew blood. The Clovis people are still legendary. They were the masters of the megafauna age. But they weren't the pioneers. They were the successors to a much older, much deeper American story that we are only just beginning to read. If you spend any time in the deeper corners of the internet lately, you'll run into a name that sounds like it belongs in a high fantasy novel. Tartaria. According to some, this was a global, high-tech empire with free energy and massive stone buildings that was wiped from our history books in a massive, coordinated cover-up. Now, as much as we love a good conspiracy, the real story of Tartaria is actually a fascinating look at how we, as humans, map the world and how we often misinterpret the past. If you look at European maps from the 15th to the 18th centuries, you'll see a massive region labeled Grand Tartary, or Great Tartaria. It covers a huge chunk of North and Central Asia, from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. To a modern eye, it looks like a single unified country. But here's the insight. Tartaria wasn't a country. It was an exonym. Think of it like the term the Orient or the Great West. For European cartographers, Tartary was a catch-all term for the vast, mysterious lands of the Tartars and Mongols. It was a blank space on the map that they filled with a name because they didn't fully understand the complex shifting borders of the Manchu dynasty, the Siberian tribes, and the remnants of the Mongol Khanates. But why does the mystery persist? Because of the architecture. Proponents of the Tartaria theory point to star forts and massive neoclassical buildings found from Russia to America that all look eerily similar. They ask, how could such similar grand buildings exist all over the world at a time when we were supposedly using horse and buggy? They suggest these were the remnants of the lost Tartarian Empire, destroyed by a mud flood that buried the first floors of these buildings. Archaeologically speaking, there is no evidence of a global mud flood. What we see instead is the incredible reach of neoclassical architecture and the Industrial Revolution. But the real value of the Tartaria mystery is what it tells us about our own history. It reminds us that Central Asia, the heart of the Silk Road, was once the most important place on Earth. It was a melting pot of cultures, high-level metalworking, and powerful horse lords that the West simply couldn't categorize. Tartaria shouldn't have existed as a single empire, but the cultures it represented, the Mongols, the Manchus, the Turkic tribes, were very real, and their influence on global trade was massive. The map mystery isn't about a suppressed high-tech empire. It's about our own historical amnesia regarding the vast, powerful cultures of the East that didn't fit into a neat Western narrative. In the high plateaus of the American Southwest, specifically where the borders of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado meet, lies one of the most haunting sights in the world. You're looking up at a sheer sandstone cliff, hundreds of feet high, and tucked into a massive natural alcove is a city. This is the world of the Anasazi, or more accurately, the ancestral Puebloans. They didn't just live in the desert. They mastered the vertical world. For centuries, these people lived on the canyon floors, farming corn, beans, and squash. But around the year 1200 AD, something changed. Suddenly, for reasons we still debate, they moved their entire society up. They built multi-story apartment complexes, some with over 150 rooms, directly into the faces of the cliffs. Places like Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde are marvels of ancient engineering. They used sandstone blocks, mortar made of mud, and wooden beams to create structures that have survived the wind and sun for nearly 1,000 years. But these weren't just simple shelters. The Anasazi were master astronomers. Their buildings, like the famous Sun Temple, were perfectly aligned to the summer and winter solstices. They could track the cycles of the moon with a precision that rivaled the Maya. In a world without writing or metal tools, they were measuring the stars from the safety of their stone balconies. However, the lost part of their story comes around 1300 AD. In less than a generation, these massive, sophisticated cliff cities were abandoned. And when I say abandoned, I mean it looks like they just stepped out for a walk and never came back. Archaeologists have found pots full of food, tools left on the floor, and even clothing. There are no signs of a massive war or a plague that wiped everyone out. They just left. Why? The Great Drought is the most likely culprit, a 30-year period with almost no rain that would have made farming impossible. But some researchers think it was more than just the weather. There's evidence of social tension and perhaps a spiritual shift that told them their time in the canyons was over. They didn't vanish into thin air. They migrated south, becoming the ancestors of the modern Hopi and Zuni people. The Anasazi shouldn't have existed in the way they did, building skyscrapers in the cracks of the earth, but they stand as a reminder of human adaptability. They show us that we can build something magnificent in the most impossible places, but also that we must be humble enough to leave when the earth stops providing. When we think of the Roman Empire, we think of gladiators, togas, the alphabet, and those magnificent arched bridges. But what if I told you that almost none of that was actually Roman? Before Rome was even a village on a hill, there was a sophisticated, luxury-loving, and deeply mysterious civilization living right next door in what is now Tuscany. They were the Etruscans, and for centuries they were the true masters of Italy. The Etruscans were the cool older siblings of the Romans. While the early Romans were basically rough farmers and bandits, the Etruscans were enjoying fine wine, wearing purple-bordered robes, and throwing lavish banquets where, shockingly for the time, women were treated as nearly equal to men. They were master goldsmiths. Their jewelry was so delicate that modern jewelers still struggle to replicate their granulation technique. But their biggest legacy was their engineering. If you've ever walked under a Roman arch, you're actually looking at Etruscan genius. They taught the Romans how to build sewers. The famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome was an Etruscan project. They gave Rome the layout of their temples, the fasces symbol of power, and even their religious rituals. Even the word Rome itself might be an Etruscan name. So why don't we learn about the Etruscan Empire in school? Because Rome did what Rome does best. They conquered, they absorbed, and then they edited the story. Around the 4th century BC, the Romans began to expand. They took Etruscan cities one by one. But they didn't just take the land, they took the culture. They adopted the Etruscan toga, the Etruscan alphabet, and the Etruscan gladiator games, which, by the way, started as Etruscan funeral sacrifices. By the time the Roman Republic was in full swing, the Etruscan language, a strange, non-Indo-European tongue that sounds like nothing else in Europe, was silenced. Their books were lost. Their history was rewritten to make it look like Rome was the sole creator of its own destiny. Today, the Etruscans survive mostly in their cities of the dead. They built incredible underground tombs designed to look exactly like the homes of the living, filled with vibrant frescoes of parties, dancing, and music. They shouldn't have been erased, because without them, there would be no Rome. They were the architects of the Roman soul, the hidden foundation of Western civilization, buried just beneath the surface of the Italian soil. Imagine for a moment that you could walk from the city of London all the way to Amsterdam or Copenhagen without ever getting your feet wet. Today, that sounds like science fiction, but only 8,000 years ago, that wasn't just possible. It was the reality. Hidden beneath the cold, gray waves of the North Sea lies a lost world known to archaeologists as Doggerland. And it wasn't just a small land bridge, it was the true heart of Europe. For decades, fishermen in the North Sea have been pulling up more than just fish. In their nets, they've found mammoth tusks, ancient lion bones, and most chillingly prehistoric spearheads and human remains. For a long time, these were seen as mere curiosities, but now we realize they are the relics of a drowned paradise. Doggerland was a vast, fertile plain filled with lagoons, marshes, and dense forests. It was a hunter-gatherer's dream, teeming with wildlife. In fact, while the rest of Europe was still struggling with the retreating ice, Doggerland was likely the most densely populated and culturally advanced part of the entire continent. So, how does an entire country, a landmass larger than the UK itself, just disappear? The answer is a terrifying reminder of how fragile our world really is. As the Earth warmed at the end of the last ice age, the glaciers melted and sea levels began to rise. But it wasn't always a slow crawl. The end of Doggerland likely happened in a terrifying instant. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered one of the largest tsunamis in human history. A wall of water, some say up to 15 or 20 meters high, raced across the North Sea. It would have slammed into the low-lying settlements of Doggerland with unimaginable force. Within hours, a world of families, hunters, and artists was simply deleted. The survivors were forced to flee to the high ground of what we now call England and the Netherlands, becoming refugees from a land that no longer existed. Doggerland shouldn't have existed only in our imagination. It is a real physical place that sits just a few meters beneath the surface of the water. It's a warning from the past. It tells us that climate change isn't just a modern headline, it's an ancient force that has already erased entire civilizations. Today, as we sail over the North Sea, we are literally floating over the rooftops of a forgotten golden age, a heartland that the ocean reclaimed, leaving us with nothing but bones in fishing nets and stories in the silt. If you've ever read the Iliad or watched the movie Troy, you've had a glimpse into our final lost world. But for a long time, historians believed that Agamemnon, Achilles, and the great city of Mycenae were nothing more than beautiful lies, stories told by Homer to entertain a later generation. That changed in the late 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann dug into a hill in Greece and pulled out a gold death mask, famously declaring, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." The Mycenaeans were the true giants of the late Bronze Age. They weren't like the philosophical, art-loving Greeks of the later classical period. No, these people were warriors. They built their citadels on high, jagged rocks, surrounded by walls so massive, some over 20 feet thick, that later Greeks believed they were built by the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants. This is where we get the term Cyclopean masonry. They looked at these stones weighing tons each, and simply couldn't believe that mere humans could have moved them. But the Mycenaeans weren't just muscle. They were meticulous bureaucrats. They developed a script called Linear B, the earliest form of the Greek language. We've found thousands of clay tablets, and they aren't filled with poetry or myths. They are receipts. They recorded every jar of olive oil, every fleece of wool, and every bronze sword in the king's inventory. They ran a highly organized top-down empire that dominated the Aegean Sea. Then, around 1200 BC, the world broke. As we saw with the Hittites, the late Bronze Age collapse hit like a tidal wave. In Mycenae, the great palaces were burned. The trade routes that brought them wealth were severed. But here's the most shocking part. When Mycenae fell, it was so total that the survivors literally forgot how to write. The sophisticated Linear B script vanished. Greece entered a 400-year dark age. It was a period of such deep amnesia that by the time the Greeks started writing again, they didn't remember the Mycenaeans as their grandfathers. They remembered them as gods and demigods. The massive ruins they left behind became the setting for the myths we know today. The Mycenaean civilization shouldn't have been a myth, but for 400 years, that's all they were. They remind us that civilization is a fragile flame. You can build walls that only giants could move, and you can keep records of every drop of oil in your kingdom, but if the fire goes out, your history might just turn into a fairy tale, waiting for a shovel to bring it back to life. So, what's the real takeaway? It's that we aren't the first advanced world, and we likely won't be the last. These 12 civilizations prove that greatness isn't measured by how long you last, but by the traces of brilliance you leave behind. History isn't just about the past, it's a mirror for our future. We build, we dream, and eventually we become stories. The question is, when the dust settles, what story will we leave behind?